Today what I'm going to do is show you how you can get started with the Claude LLM API. Claude is very similar to ChatGPT in that you can submit prompts and get back responses. We're going to go through the API together, and of course I'm going to explain all the different concepts which you can use going forward if you want to build your own applications with Claude. And of course we're going to build a Python application from scratch that's going to interact with the new Claude model. I'm going to show you how you can get responses back from your prompts and also get back streaming responses. I love teaching programming with fun and interesting projects like this, so if that's something that you're interested in, make sure you tap the like button and of course subscribe for future videos like this. With that said, let's get started. Okay, as always, I like to spend some time going over the API documentation. You've probably seen in my previous videos, the Spotify API tutorial, for example, I spent a good amount of time going through the API documentation. The reason why I like to do that is because I think it's really important, especially as developers, beginner programmers, that you spend time understanding what's available to you when you're building out your application. When you interact with an API, you kind of want to understand how to authenticate with that API, things that you should keep in mind, best practices, but most importantly, what kind of data that API gives you. The documentation, of course, is the best place to get started, and for Anthropic, which is the company behind Claude, I'm on the API documentation here. And before I deep dive into the API documentation, there's one section that I highly recommend that you take a look at, and it is the guide section. Now this guide section on the left hand side, there's quite a lot going on. If you are from the Anthropic team and you are watching this video, I do think this area can be improved. Do get in touch if that's something you want to discuss, but it is quite overwhelming. But on the whole, I think if you're able to go through it, this does show you how you can get started with the Claude API, the model, and it's got a really good or decent prompt engineering tutorial, right? So if you scroll down here, you can see they've just brain dumped, I think 100 or so slides on best practices for using the Claude API and prompt engineering in general, and how to essentially get the best results from the Claude model. I've gone through these slides. They also have an interactive tutorial on a Google Sheets somewhere in this documentation, and of course they've also got some ideas and some recommendations for constructing a prompt, organizing a prompt. They give you useful hacks for how you can write really good prompts, or things to keep in mind when interacting with the Claude model. And they've also got some use cases here that might be relevant to you. So for example, if you want to build an application that might do some content moderation using the Claude model, then here, for example, they're giving you an idea of a prompt and telling you how you can populate the different roles. So I'll get into this later on, but overall, this, although it can be improved, it's definitely a good place to start in terms of understanding the Claude model, understanding how it works, understanding how to write good prompts, and use cases and prompts that other people have contributed. So this is a really good start. I'd highly recommend checking out the guide section, but of course we're now going to go over to the API reference. So you've got the getting started section here, and it tells you how you can access the API. You can use the web console, but of course we're going to be writing a Python program that's going to interact directly with the Claude model, so we're not going to be using the console. In terms of authentication, so when you're authenticating with the Claude API, you're going to need an API key. You provide that in the header, and of course you can make a request with curl, but because we're going to be using the Python client, so Claude provide a SDK, which is a library in Python that allows you to interact with the Claude API directly, and they take care or make authentication a bit easier for you, so you don't have to set up a Python request and pass in the header. You don't need to do much of that. Of course, I'm going to show you that shortly. There are a few other things to keep in mind. So they've got a section about IP addresses. This is only relevant if you're building a application that you're going to deploy to the cloud. You're just going to need to make sure that you update your outbound security rules. For most people, you won't need to worry about that. They have a section about versions, and in this section they talk about the different Anthropic versions. Again, the client takes care of this for you, so you don't need to worry too much about it. Now the error section tells you the different errors that the Claude API might return, and the rate limit one is definitely one to keep an eye on, because I believe at the moment it's in beta, and they've put a note here saying that If you exceed the rate limit, once you go live, we'll discuss the appropriate rate limit with you. But most importantly, they say here that at the moment, your organization can make at most one request at a time to our API, right? So they have limited it while it is in this beta phase. So just keep that in mind if you're building the application. Don't jump to deploy it into production. They do have rate limits in place. And error handling, of course, is something that generally, not just rate limit errors, but these other errors you should consider handling, especially if you're building an application that you're going to deploy to production. They've also got the client SDK section here, and this tells you what libraries they have available for interacting with the Claude API. They have one for Python, that's the one we're going to be using, and they have one for TypeScript too. So you've also got the model section, and this shows you the currently available models from Claude, and of course the new 2.1 model. The announcement is that it has a context window size of 200,000 tokens. Very quickly, if you aren't familiar with LLMs don't count words in the same way we as humans do. They count tokens, right? Tokens is the unit of a cost. So just keep that in mind. When you're submitting a prompt, it's not the number of words in that prompt, it's the number of tokens that prompt will cost. And Claude provide you a nice helper function that allow you to get or calculate the number of tokens that your prompt is going to cost, and it'll give you that number. And that's really important, especially if you're building an application. You kind of want to know how much you're going to be consuming or how many tokens you're going to be consuming as you scale up your application. Now, context window sizes are going to be more important for us as developers because we want to be able to give as much information as we can to Claude in a single request, right? And we want Claude to remember it. So for example, if you're building an application, let's say to summarize PDFs, with having a large context window size like this, what we can do is sort of get a dozen PDFs, a few, let's say, books as PDFs. We can get all the text from those PDFs, and then in a single request, we can pass all of that text in a single prompt to Claude, right? And the context window size of 200,000 tokens enables that to happen, right? And as that context window size continues to increase, we can pass more and more information in a single request to Claude, and that's going to be powerful for us, and that's good news for us as developers. So there's just one more section I want to go over, and then we're going to write some code. That section is the messages API, right? And this is essentially the core of where you're going to be focusing most of your efforts when it comes to building an application that works with Claude. The message API is essentially how you're going to build up your prompt and send it off to Claude. And previously they had the text completions API, but as you can see, they've deprecated it. It's the older way of doing it in favor of this new messages API. And it is quite straightforward, as you can see here. Essentially what you do is you create a message that you're going to be sending as a post request. But again, we're going to be using the client library, so we don't need to set up that request. We're going to do this together, so don't worry too much about the detail for now. But what you do is in this message, you specify what model of Claude you want to use. We're going to be using Claude 2.1. You specify the messages, right? So this is kind of where you put your prompt. And you can also pass in a historic conversation. So let's say you're going back and forth with Claude. In this case, they've given you example. Let's say you've started your or you've submitted a message or prompt to Claude with the prompt "Hello there," and then Claude responds back with "Hi, I'm Claude. How can I help you?" And then you respond back with "Can you explain LLMs in plain English?" For every request, what you can do is you can add to this messages array. Right, so for every message that you get back from Claude and for every message that you send to Claude, you kind of build up this history, right? This messages array. And then what you do is as you call out to Claude, you pass this messages array, right? And that message array will have the latest prompt that you want to request from Claude, right? So the idea is that you can kind of maintain and keep this history, and you can give it to Claude as you continue that conversation, right? Rather than, asking Claude a single prompt and getting back a response. This kind of facilitates that back and forth, which is very realistic when it comes to us working with ChatGPT, for example, and in this case, Claude. Now, one thing I forgot to mention is they have this notion of user and assistant. So user is essentially going to be your prompt. So you put that in between here, and that's going to be in the content key. And then assistant is going to be what Claude gives back to you. And then, of course, user is what you send to Claude, right? So again, you can build up these messages. And for our example, we're just going to be sending a single prompt, but we're going to be using a system prompt. Essentially, system prompts is a way for you to be able to tell Claude to assume a certain role, right? you want Claude to kind of stay in a particular character, for example. This is just one way you can use it, right? Or another way is you can just specify that you want Claude to follow a certain set of rules and instructions before you even send your prompt, right? So the idea is that you can set up Claude by giving it context, by giving it instructions before you actually send over your prompt. And the reason why this is powerful is because you can kind of dictate before Claude even asks the question, before Claude even responds, you can dictate exactly what you want in the response. And I found this to be particularly useful. As you can see here, what they say is that with the benefits of system prompts is that it maintains personality for longer conversations, exhibits more creative and natural behavior. You can give it rules and guardrails, context for user input, and they've also given some detail on how you can use system prompts on the new messages API, right? And as you can see, it's quite straightforward. All you need to do is pass in a value for this system variable here. So of course we're going to be doing that together. I'll show you in the Python application that we build. We're going to make use of this system prompt, of course, to demonstrate the new model. Now there's just a few more things in the messages API. You can define the max number of tokens that you want Claude to generate before stopping. That might be handy, especially if you're starting to get quite large responses back. The other thing is that whether you want the message as back as a stream, I'm going to be showing you an example of that. The temperature, so ideally what you want to do is you want a lower temperature for kind of analytic and multiple, they say it here, right? So analytical multiple choice tasks, or closer to 1 for like generative or creative tasks, right? So you can kind of adjust this temperature, see what works for you. I highly recommend just testing. But I think on the whole, I found 1 or the default to work fine for me. Alright, so that's it. There wasn't that much in this API documentation. Hopefully gives you a good overview of the messages API, the different parts of the documentation, and of course the resources available for you to learn more about interacting with Claude and prompt engineering. But I think now it's time for us to write a Python application that's going to use the new Claude model and interact with the Anthropic API. Alright, my favorite part of the video is time to write some code. So the first thing that I've done is I've created a project directory and I've called it Claude-API. And for this video, you can use any editor you like, but I'm going to be using NeoVim. But before I open up that editor, let's create some files. So the first file that I want to create is the requirements.txt file. And that's going to have the requirements for this project. There's only one requirement, but it's good, generally speaking, especially when you're building out a project, to have all of your requirements and dependencies and the versions of those dependencies in a single file, right? So that's the first file we're creating. The second one is the main.py file. That's going to be the file where we write all of our code. And then the last file that I'm going to make is an environment variable file. So that's where we're going to put our API key. And we're going to source that in the environment, right? Whenever you're building a production application, or generally these days anyway, when I even build develop applications or development applications locally, I don't like to hard code my API keys in these files. So you shouldn't either. And so you should always have an environment file where you put it in there, and in production you probably would store that using some secrets manager service. And of course I'm using derenv, which automatically sources that. You don't need to worry about that for now. Alright, so I think that's all the files for this project. Let me just double check that they're there. That looks good. Alright, so I'm going to open up NeoVim in this directory, and then I'm going to open up the main.py file. Right, so the first thing that I'm going to do is kind of import a few libraries that we're going to be using for this project. So the first one is going to be OS, that's the built-in Python library. Second one is going to be from Anthropic. We're going to import Anthropic, and then we're going to import some types from the Anthropic library. We're just going to import one. I think we only need the message param. All right. So that's just a few imports, and then what we're going to do. So the first thing we're going to do is create the Anthropic client, right? So this is the client that we're going to use to interact with the Claude or Anthropic API, right? So it's quite straightforward, given that Anthropic provide the helper in the library for you. All you need to do, in this case, I'm just going to type in client is equal to Anthropic. And then in the brackets, I want to specify the API key. and I'm going to set that equal to os.environment.get and the name of my API key, right? So this is going to be Anthropic API key. Sometimes I can't see my keyboard with the microphone right in front of me, but all right. So although we haven't put that in the environment variable file yet, I'll do that with you in a second. But essentially what we're going to do in that file, in that .env file that we created a second ago, we're going to have a key called Anthropic API key. We're going to set that value to the API key that we get on the Claude dashboard. And then the idea is that when we run this application, we're going to be pulling that API key from the environment. And in this case, what we're doing is we're setting up our Anthropic client that we're then going to use to interact with the Anthropic API. Right, so let's start writing our main method. So what we're going to do is, the first thing we want to do anyway is ask the user to enter a prompt, right? So I'm going to create a variable called prompt, set that equal to input, enter your prompt. Then what we're going to do is have a variable called system prompt, and we'll set it equal to none for now. As I mentioned, with the new Claude 2.1 model, you can send the model a system prompt. And what that will do is you give it some context, you can provide some instructions, some rules in that system prompt. So Claude is going to look at that, it's going to understand that, and then what it will do is off the back of that, when it gives you back a response, it's going to follow all those rules and all that context that you provided in the system prompt, right? So this is the main prompt that we're going to submit to Claude. This is the system prompt that Claude's going to look at in advance before it gives you a response back to this prompt, right? So hopefully that made sense. All right, and then the last thing we're going to do is create a method called submit prompt, or call this method called submit prompt. That's going to take in our prompt, that's going to take in the system prompt. We'll set that equal to system prompt. And then this one we will you will define this above. So I'll take that take that up here. Okay, that's good. Let's just add some spacing. Vim can be funny sometimes, or NeoVim. All right, so now we've got that in place. Oh, I just need to do here. All right, so this is where we're now going to call out to the Anthropic client. So this client we created here earlier on, we're now going to submit the prompt and the system prompt to Claude using this client. So what we want is a streaming response, right? We want Claude to give back the response as it generates it, right? We don't want to have to wait however many seconds it would take to get back the full response. We want to get whatever Claude gives us as it's giving it to us, right? So that's going to be in the form of a stream. So to do that, we will type with client.messages.stream. And then what we're going to do in here is we're going to pass in the model. Now the model that we're going to be used is Claude 2.1. They do have older models, but Claude 2.1 I mentioned is the one that allows you to use the system prompts. The second thing, of course, is we're going to set the system equal to the system prompt. Then we have to define the maximum number of tokens that we want back from the response. For now, I think it's 4096 is the max, but for the prompts that we're going to be using, 1024 should be enough, right? And then the last thing that you want to create is the messages or set is the messages array. So I showed you in the API documentation that this messages array, what it should contain is any prompt that you send to Claude and any response that Claude gives back, right? And what you want to do ideally, here I've kind of defined it in line, but you want to have this messages array continue to add any prompt that you send off to Claude, any response that you get back, right? You want to build up this messages array, and so that facilitates a back and forth conversation with Claude, right? In this instance, we only want to submit one prompt, and we just want to get one response back. We don't want anything more than that, so we don't need to build up that array. But if you're building an application where you kind of want to maintain or build up that history and give that history to Claude so that it can continue that conversation, you're going to need to have a messages array that you keep up to date. So all we need to do is type in role. In this case, it's going to be us as the user, and then we're going to set content, which is going to be the content of the prompt itself. and then we are good to go. Right, so let's close out this context manager. Before I do that, I've just noticed that the system prompt cannot be none, of course. And then what we'll do to close out this context manager is we will say now we've set up the stream object, we're going to call it stream. And then I'm going to set up a try catch. And what we're going to do in here is process the stream that comes back from Claude. And to do that, all we're going to do, keep it simple, we're just going to print it out onto the screen. So we're going to do for text in stream.text_stream, which is going to be the text that is coming back in the stream. We're going to print the text out. We don't want anything at the end of it, and then we're going to set flush equal to true. And then once we've printed out, whatever comes back, it might be line by line, it might be a couple of words at a time. Just in case an exception occurs, I want to print this out onto the screen, and we're going to raise as well, right? Just in case some error occurs, it's good to handle that error. And I think that is good to go. There's one more method that I want to add, and that is to estimate the number of tokens that our prompt is going to cost. So when you're working with an LLM API, it's really important to understand that its unit of currency is tokens, right? So what you want to ideally keep track of is how much you're kind of spending in tokens whenever you're submitting a prompt to the API. And thankfully, the Anthropic client give you a nice helper method for you to be able to estimate or get the total number of tokens given a prompt before you actually submit it, right? So I'm just going to wrap that in our own method. I'll call it def estimate tokens. That's going to take in a prompt. I might move this up above actually. I think let's have that above here, right? Yeah. So we're going to have this method, and then the method itself, it's quite straightforward. So we're going to say have a variable called count, set it equal to client, which is the client we've defined above, and the method that Claude give you, or Anthropic gives you, is count tokens, right? That's going to take in our prompt, and then what we can do is you can return the count, right? So this handy method provided by Claude, I'm going to go, if I just go into it, as you can see here, count the number of tokens in a given string. So we're going to give it our prompt, and it's going to return back the number of tokens. It's good to keep track of this, especially if you're building an application that's using the Anthropic client in production. You want to keep track of how many tokens you're using per prompt. And then what I want to do down below here, when we run our application, before we submit our prompt, I will have a method that prints out tokens for this request. And that's going to be set equal to estimate tokens, and that's going to take in our prompt. And so that way we just know before we send off the prompt how many tokens it's going to cost. All right, and then the last thing that we need to do is give a value for the system prompt. So to do that, I'm actually going to go back to the Anthropic documentation, and I'm in the system prompt section. I will put a link for this in the description below. Now, if you scroll down, they have quite a few examples and good techniques for how you can use system prompts. And I like this one. This one was quite realistic. So say you run an e-commerce website, maybe you sell some clothes or something, and you want, on the back end, you want a way for Claude to be able to classify all the emails that you get from your customers, right? So imagine you're getting customers every day sending you emails, and they might be related to everything from billing to stock, shipment, how much is left in the warehouse, whatever it might be, right? And what you want Claude to do is you want it to classify all of these emails for you, right? Just to make your life a bit easier. And this is perfect. This is like the perfect use case for a system prompt. So here is an example of one in that context, which is, Claude, you are a customer service agent tasked with classifying emails by type. Please output your answer and justify your classification. And these are the categories that you want Claude to attempt to classify the customer emails into. So is it a pre-sale question? Is it a billing question? Is it a broken or defective item, right? And then the idea is that you give Claude this system prompt. I'm going to copy it. And then what you do is you'll give it back, you'll give Claude the system prompt, but also what prompt the user entered, right? And in this context, in this scenario, the user input is going to be the email, right? And so the reason why this is very handy is because any email that comes in, is going to be classified into one of these categories, right? And as you can imagine, if you're running a website like this, is very handy to be able to quickly have a good overview of, you know, how many billing questions you're getting, right? So I'm going to copy over this system prompt, go back to my editor, and then what I'll do is I'll create a multi-line string, and then if I go up above, I'll paste it here, and then we'll just indent, right? Now, of course, we're running this application locally, right? And, you know, we're going to be taking the input from the user. So when we run it locally, we're going to be entering the prompt. But, you know, this is just hypothetical, right? In a real world scenario, this the contents of this prompt would be the email, right? So when we're running this application, we're just going to pretend that we're writing an email to make this example work, right? So that's the system prompt there. I think that's ready. So let's give this application a run. Right, so I've exited my editor. There's just a few things that we need to do before we can run the application. So the first thing that we need to do is, as we did earlier on, we created a file called .env. In this file, you need to have a line that is just like this, which is export space Anthropic API _ key, and you need to set that equal to your API key for Anthropic. Now, I'm not going to show the contents of my .env file because that has my API key, but I promise you it's just like this. Export space Anthropic API key equal to, and then the value, which is your API key. You need to have that in that .env file, and then you can source it by typing source.env, right? So that will put the API key in your environment, right? So that's the first thing that we need to do. The second thing that we need to do is we need to create a virtual environment in which we install the Anthropic library. So to do that, we can type in Python 3-m venv, and I'm going to call my virtual environment.venv, and then we're going to activate it by typing in source venv bin activate. And then what we'll do is inside this virtual environment, we're going to install the contents of the requirements.txt file. The requirements.txt file just has one dependency, Anthropic. We've set that equal to this version, which is 0.16.0, right? So we're just going to install that inside the virtual environment by typing pip install -r requirements.txt. And as you can see, it's installing. It's got a lot of related dependencies. So that's installed, and that's everything we need. Now we should be able to run our application. Right, so to run our application, type in Python 3 space main.py, and the first thing that we're going to be asked for is our prompt. So again, we're assuming the role as if we're a customer and we're sending an email. So pretend you're writing an email here, right? And we're writing an email to this e-commerce website. So the email that I'm going to write is, you know, my card has been charged twice, right? Because we know based on the system prompt that Claude is going to categorize this into one of those categories that we gave it. So yeah, this is the email that we're going to write. My card has been charged twice. What happened? I'm an angry customer. All right, type enter. Tokens for this request, and as you can see, it's 11 tokens. And it has printed out the stream where each one is on its own line. So not the best demo here, but as you can see, it worked, right? Which is we're getting back the response, or we got back the response as a stream, and Claude did give us back the response that we expected. Right, congratulations, you wrote a Python application that interacts with Anthropic's Claude 2.1 model. You built up a really good understanding of how the API works, you looked at the documentation, you got a better understanding of system prompts, and overall you were able to write a Python application that got back the response from Claude as a stream. Now you've got a really good idea of how the Anthropic client works and how the Claude 2.1 model works, so hopefully you can take this forward to now build up your own AI applications. It takes me a really long time to make these videos, so please do give this video a like, and of course subscribe if you want to learn programming with fun and interesting projects like this. I hope you enjoyed it, and other than that, have a lovely day. See ya.